Top of the week, everybody. Shavua Tov, Hagud Tavach. A beautiful Monday morning, despite the grayness and rain on today's Monday morning. Nothing can dampen our spirits, and nothing can prevent us from growing. So I hope everybody's well and healthy and safe. Let's begin first by thanking our generous sponsors. Our contemporary cases of Shas learning this morning is generously sponsored by Dr. Ben and Alinda Hendon, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Alinda's beloved mother, Eileen Lewis Dickman, Chaya Sarah Bas Tevya. Her neshama should have an aliyah and the merit and schus of studying Torah together. It should be a merit for the entire family. Thank you for your generous sponsorship. Okay, we have a very interesting case today to go through, and it's actually a little bit on the heels of what we've learned previously, and not necessarily in this series, but we'll remember that a number of months ago now at this point, we learned the very interesting case. It was the case that was a shaila that was asked to the Radbaz. And the question that was asked to the Radbaz is, what would happen in a situation where a person has the opportunity to get out of jail for one day? You have the first mitzvah that you have, or do you wait for call it a meta mitzvah? So let's just say you've been incarcerated. That's the case that was asked him, if you remember, right? Remember that case that he was incarcerated prisoner was incarcerated for over an extended period of time, and now he's able to get out of jail. So which one does he can choose which day he wants to go out? So the answer, if you'll remember, is that we didn't say that he should wait for days like public reading of the Megillah because of Pesumei Nisa, or big days like Yom Kippur, or various other days that would seem to jump out at us, but rather we say that a person should choose the day, the mitzvah that comes first. That means even if it's just a plain Jane Tuesday with, going to a shachris, a mincha ma'ir, putting on tefillin, or any Shabbos, or any mitzvah that a person would be able to do, because how are we and who are we to rank mitzvahs? How can we possibly know which mitzvah is greater than another? And therefore, any mitzvah that comes into my hand to be able to perform, to be able to do, so I don't want to miss the opportunity. Right? We don't ein mavirin al mitzvahs. We don't pass over mitzvahs as they present themselves. So we see here that this is a very important principle, knowing that there are a whole onslaught of just commentaries abound, trying to consider which mitzvah this is greater, this is less than, this is carries this amount of punishment, this amount of reward. And of course, we know that there's a level of that we are told about, that there are certain mitzvahs that, for example, the mitzvah of Kabidas Avicha V'Simech we had in last week's parsha, to honor our mother and honor our father. It's Laman Yarich and Yimechat. It is what the Torah promises will extend one's days, one's years. So what we understand is that that's in the world of regard of performance of a mitzvah and reward for mitzvah. We also know that the concept of punishment and onesh for an aveira has different levels of it. There's that which is chayiv b'idei shemayim, chayiv b'idei adam, through Beis Din. So we know that there's different ranking systems and different things as it relates to how to think about how to navigate through certain mitzvahs. But we know that the halacha, lamaisa, the practical law is that we grab the first mitzvah that we have an opportunity to perform. And so therefore we don't really rank mitzvahs, we just grab them as they're available to us. So that's what brings us to our very interesting case today. Now, obviously, as we've learned in the past, the cases that we study are just really they're specific cases that were actual and in real time truly happened and were asked to venerable sages. But as I like to say, they're a dimion. They are just an example, a dogma of other examples in different cases where it could apply. For example, like the case of a person who's incarcerated, they come out of jail, they don't know which mitzvah they should do. They should wait or they should do the first one. Or in other situations where, for example, we'll just use this as a backdrop. Let's say a person, because of the pandemic, has been kind of sequestered at home for a good period of time, or even if they're going out limited. So is there a pecking order of what a person should choose, what they're going to go out for? So if I'm going to go out for, the most important mitzvah, I'm going to go out for something that's, the first possible mitzvah. So if I'm going to be particular and nuanced as it relates to that, how do I have a Torah perspective as to how I choose? So let's look at, this is chapter 29. I'll translate the Hebrew. It's called Siman Chavtes. And the case is an interesting case. The case is Chola Masukan. There was a very sick person, Hasovel Yisurim Kashim, who was able to endure great suffering. Meaning, I guess he was very sick and he was able to, whether it was the pain of the illness or just the hardships associated with it. So v'hu yochol lavo lemeshech sha'a leveis hakneses. Now this is a fellow that even though he had great difficulty and he was in tremendous pain, he was able to though find, I guess, 1 hour in the day that he can go to the Beis HaKnesses, he can go to shul. And the question, morphine, I guess right after he got morphine, he had 1 hour that he was comfortable, he was less in dramatic pain. It's a amna muchalash. Now, because of the fact that he was treated, he was obviously very weak. But it didn't knock him out completely. He was able to do something. So he has an hour in the day. So you have an hour in your day to do something virtuous. He wants to know if he's an hour in the day to come. He knows he's going to come to shul for 1 hour in the day. So he doesn't know which hour should he come to. Should he come ha'im l'tfila? Should he come for davening? Oh, lahakdim l'shir daf yomi, or should he come earlier and come to the daf yomi? So that means, let's just assume for the argument's sake that the davening is at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it's tefillah b'tzibor, and it's davening, in a minyan that he's always davened in, and there's a daf yomi shir at 7 o'clock in the morning. So again, what we say, as we've learned previously, that it's the first mitzvah, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of studying Torah, and so therefore he should jump at that mitzvah, or do we say that no, he should do something that's more communal? He should wait and he should daven tefillah b'tzibor. The power and the necessity of tefillah b'tzibor, knowing, of course, that maybe this case is different in the sense that he could really learn at home. He could daven at home. So how do we weigh that? So here's this interesting situation. He's not sure when he should come. He's gonna come. Is it davening or is it for daf yomi? And this is the last part, which is a significant part. Mechaya oso. And his coming to the shul for that hour is mechayo. So what's mechayo? So it means it strengthens him, it revives him, it revitalizes him. V'noisen le'koyach, and it gives him strength. L'chol hayom, for the entire day. La'avodas haborei, to serve God. So the question is, bome yivchar, which one should he choose? Everybody got that question? He's going to give 1 hour to the shul. He's going to come for the either davening or the daf yomi shir, and we know that his coming to the shul gives him strength. It's mechaye him, it strengthens him, it revitalizes him, revives him, and he wants to know which one should he choose to come to. Okay, questions on the question? So far, so good? Okay, but you can see already now how it's set up, that this could be something that we could be thinking about today. You know that someone's going to give a very small amount of time to coming out into public. And then we wonder is which one is more important. And noting, obviously, when we think about which mitzvahs, thinking about the category of mitzvahs, so therefore whichever mitzvah comes first is the mitzvah that I should do. Or do we say that these are two specific mitzvahs, learning Torah and davening, that really don't need to be done together with other people? Or do we say that they have a special connection, that if in fact they are? Meaning, is there a difference between a person who learns by themselves versus learning in a group versus a person who davens by themselves, or they daven in a group? Now we all know that you can learn by yourself and you can daven by yourself, but we also know that the Shulchan Aruch puts a huge amount of emphasis on tefillah b'tzibor, davening together with people. So much so that the Rambam records, Maimonides teaches, that one of the great reasons why tefillah b'tzibor is so significant is that afilu rasha be'eda, so even a wicked person in your company, if that person is in the minyan, his tefillos, his prayers are able to be elevated, extended, and successful because of the fact that he is in the company of other people. That's the mila, that's the merit of one of the many merits of tefillah b'tzibor. But we don't see that that's the same thing. Obviously, when you learn in a room with a lot of people and you come to a daf yomi shir or any shir, so you're inspired by, uplifted by the sound of Torah, by the give and the take of the Torah, you're maybe going to feel elevated, you're going to be able to understand the material better. The Gemara says that a person who studies with others can't be compared to a person who studies by themselves, because you sharpen each other, you have a more brazenness to which you approach it, in the sense that you really want to know it, not in an arrogant way, but in a real uncover the truth type of way. But you don't really need to. Is it just an enhancement thing, or is it like an obligation thing? We think of minyan, which of course it is an obligation thing, and that's how we should think of it. But technically speaking, if a person misses a minyan for whatever the reason, that does not exempt them from the obligation of tefillah. A person misses the daf yomi shir, you still do the daf yomi. You don't have to go to a daf yomi shir to fulfill the daf yomi or learning at all, for that matter. So is this, obviously it's not completely related to the previous case. I just wanted to mention it because I know that we've learned stuff similar to it, where a person has a choice. So which one do you choose? In that case, the conclusion was choose that which comes first. Here in this case, the question is, where I'm able to do both of them at home. And even though it is that it's mechaye also, and therefore it's significant because it revitalizes him. So the question then, which one is it that he should choose? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Which one should he choose?
Yeah, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, right?
Okay, good. I like that. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. So therefore you would say, not because of there's reason Magdim the mitzvah, so it's the first mitzvah, but you say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, which means that it's a meta mitzvah. So that I like that idea. The struggle with that is that there are a number of things in Shas that are called Keneged Kulam, which is a big shaila in halacha, like, Shabbos Keneged Kulam and Tzitzis Keneged Kulam and various others. But we do say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, and so therefore it would seem to be Kolol es Hakol, right? It includes and encapsulates everything. Okay, good. Let's vote in the Talmud Torah.
Is there any reason why we're looking at that? It's because he's not well that there's a question. If he were just had no other problems, would it create a problem of what he did first?
It would create a quandary in any circumstance. So the answer is no, not necessarily. It's just part of the case that dramatizes what is the incident of how he has to choose, right? But theoretically, if there's anything such as coronavirus or such as, you're traveling and you're on business and you just, or there's something that prevents you from doing everything and anything that you need to do, right? This is just a little bit more of a dramatic case because he's ill, right? So then the opposite, I would actually say that maybe because of the fact that he's ill, we know that a person who's sick, as we're going to see in some of the footnotes here in a minute, a person who's sick is pater's exempt from tefillah, a person's exempt from mitzvahs, really, when a person is unable to do that. We'll see what that means. But maybe because of he's ill, we're seeing that there's a certain mesiras nefesh, there's a certain desire, great burning yearning to be able to do whatever he can, even that he's sick, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be that. The case is not particular to the fact that he's sick, except for the fact that even though he's sick and after he takes medication to ease his pain, that desire is still a great desire, and he wants that hour. And that hour, even though you would argue like, you should stay home because listen, you're sick. No, it's mechayo, so it strengthens him. But I think it could be said that really in any situation, assuming that it's a justifiable reason, so now you're home for whatever the reason, or you're prevented for whatever the reason, you're fearful for whatever the reason. And now the question now is, so if you have an opportunity to do something for an hour, like what's your choice? What are you going to do? Famously, my Rabbi used to always quote the famous Chazal, let's just say you have an hour to learn, or you have really 5 minutes to learn. What would you choose to learn? What would you choose to study? And the answer is you would choose to study something that's going to encourage you to study something else. So they say that you should learn Musar. Because if you learn Musar, then you're going to decide, the Gemara says, if you learn Musar, then you're going to be thrust into the base measures to learn more and other things. So the question is, what's going to facilitate, is this a question of one thing facilitating another thing? Or is this a function of, you're in a circumstance and now we really have only the opportunity and the possibility to choose one thing. So if I'm able to choose one thing, which thing should I choose and why? So I don't think it's necessarily specific to the fact that he's ill. And that's why I think by extension, it can apply to really anybody's, whatever, it's a perceived limitation, and it could be a manufactured limitation, or it could be just a circumstance that just makes it impossible to do both. It's as we say in halacha, it's efshar l'kayim shnehem. It's not possible to do both things. And if it's not possible to do both things, so which one should I choose? Does that make sense? Then does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so let's see where we go here. Okay.
Wait, can I ask just one more question?
Of course, sure.
And maybe you touched on this a little bit. So it sounds like if all things being equal, well, no, actually, you're not saying that. I know that there's a pecking order kind of idea, but let's say there is a pecking order, but the guy's like, but I feel like really, if I go to this one, even though it might be lower in the pecking order, that's what's going to really do it for me. Is there, an allowance for that kind of thing? So and you might be getting to that at some point.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. The answer is, typically we say no, not necessarily, even though it seems to be counterintuitive of the direction we're headed. And usually we only really get to that place when a person's like either at the end of their life or they've lost their faculties to be able to really choose. And we want to, kind of massage them and massage their anguish and pain. Because the fact that a person would choose something is really something that is unique to a status of which we find ourselves on. We might like certain mitzvos, we like certain foods, we like certain people, right? But at the end of the day is, even though something might not be as as chosen or delightful as something else, not necessarily. I might find I would get a tremendous chizuk if I wait till to hearing the Megillah, to hearing the story of Esther, and I feel very strengthened by that, but not necessarily, because technically it should be that any mitzvah should strengthen a person. Now, what happens if a person doesn't feel strengthened? So that becomes a little bit of a different question. I'll feel really strong. Depends on their mental state, depends on their physical state, and it really depends on their circumstance. That's why we get into categories such as a tinok shenishba, a person who's who's less learned, a person who doesn't understand things in a certain way. That's why the Chazal, the Gemara, talks about concepts like shemetoch lo lishma bo lishma, which means if even though you would be choosing the wrong thing, it will then bring you to be able to choose the right thing. So sure, if the person's not going to do anything, if you're not going to let them choose what they want versus what they should choose, then certainly we'd let them choose what they want as opposed to missing it completely. But all things being equal, even though a person might choose that I don't really want that, I don't want that as much as I want something else, it might be that because of the fact that we have an obligation to really treat the mitzvahs really all the same, even though there might be or might not be reward or punishment discrepancies, we really have to try to condition ourselves to be able to see the mitzvahs in the same way. And I'll actually tell you, which is interesting as an addendum to that. Last week we read the Esther Dibros, we read the Parsha of Parshas Yisro, right? So if you remember from years past, or if you remember from this Shabbos, you know what happened when we get to the Esther Dibros, the 10 Commandments? So usually the Gabbai gives a clap on the stender and everybody stands up for the reading of the Decalogue, right? Everybody familiar with that?
Yeah.
So that's actually a big machlokas, huge machlokas. In today's times, people do that. It's more of like, it become like a universal custom, but actually the sages have debated that for many, actually centuries. Why? Because imagine what the scene is. What are you suggesting? What are you saying when you stand up for the Decalogue and you've been sitting for the rest of the Torah reading? You're suggesting that there are certain parts of the Torah that are more significant and more necessary than other parts. Now, maybe you would argue that the 10 Commandments can't be rivaled. That could be, but in a certain sense, that was part of the language of davening every single day. Part of what was actually how the tefillah was established would be to recite the 10 Commandments. But the problem was, you had over the centuries the Baisusim, you had the Kirayim, the Karites, you had people that the individuals who would just interpret the basics without the accoutrements, if you will. So what would happen? They would assume that the most important part of the Torah is the 10 Commandments. There's a guy that I know, he used to say to me, Rabbi, I'm a 10 Commandment Jew, right? He wasn't joking. Now, when I started listing the 10 Commandments, he started to realize, okay, I'm about a 6 Commandment Jew. And then we narrowed it down a little bit. So you would get into dangerous territory when you stand for someone and not stand for others, and you act towards one thing and not towards another thing. But the answer is that, there are situations where just because you want to give them a certain love or a taste of, a child so excited about learning, or an adult could be turned on because they've never studied Torah before. So they might say, I really enjoy this, but you want to teach people to really try to look at mitzvos in the same level of alacrity and their performance, even though they might or might not feel so good. And that's where emotions and intellect sometimes collide with each other. Shotness isn't so exciting, and parts of certain esoteric parts of karbanos and other mitzvahs are just like, okay, I'll do it because I have to do it, but I'm not excited about it. Whereas if I have shalach manos and I have a Purim costume and I have parts of Shabbos, some people find that's, I'll do that, but I'll do no more. Which is why a large swath of people, even in our own faith, they don't even know. I remember the first time when I was speaking at an event here in South Florida to a group of teenagers, and we were talking about Passover, and two things became very mind-blowing to me. The first is when I mentioned God, a young lady raised her hand. She said, Rabbi, what does God have to do with Passover? That was the first, what does that mean? But the second thing is I said something about the first days and the second days, to which another one didn't understand what that meant. What's the first days, second days? We become very chapter and verse, almost automatic things that we know but most people, you'd be, I mean, I don't know if you're surprised to know this, but a lot of people don't even follow the second days. The first days of Passover exciting. It's a family dinner. It's the Seder. It's history. It's nostalgia. It's dipping. It's 4 questions. It's 4 cups of wine. You get second days of Pesach. What do you do second days of Pesach? What do you just eat matzah? I did that already. Are you serious? Like the Torah told me that. So we get, it's for sure gets into a little bit more of a dangerous territory to be in a certain choosing. Don't forget, we went from, this is a famous statement, the Chazal tell us that we went from being a chosen people to we became a choosing people. Now, obviously, we have the whole concept of Bechiras Chavshis, of free will and choosing. That's what makes us elevated. That's what even catapults us beyond the level of the angels. But also choosing is a very dangerous thing because we can sometimes choose the wrong things. So that's where that category could, I mean, obviously, there are other variables that have to be considered case by case, but very basic to your question is that, yeah, even though there might be something that you might like more, there's a Torah lesson to choosing it because God chose it to be included in the Torah, and therefore if it's first and that's what it is, then that's what it is.
Got it.
Okay, so here on this question, let's continue here. So on the bottom of the page in your handouts, if you have this question was asked to this Rav, let's call him Rav Michal for now, and he asked this Rabbi Fisher. These names aren't majorly important to what we're learning together. These were prominent figures. So he answers, and he explains, these are big rabbis, that he says that actually you could choose, he should go to the Daf Yomi. Now, what's the reason why I should choose to go to the Daf Yomi? So in the footnotes, he explains the following, and I'll just obviously read it, but translate inside. He says, there are a number of reasons why this answer should be. Like, when a person asks a question and you give them an answer, so there's 2 types of people that ask a question to me or to others. They'll say, Rabbi, what's the halacha? Is it kosher or is it treif? Is it mutter or is it usher? Is it permissible or is it prohibited? They just want a yes or no. They want to know if their spoon needs to be kosher. They want to know if their spoon needs to be thrown away. They want to know if they can eat the dinner that they prepared. They just want yes or no. They want the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch version. And then there are people that will say, okay, that's the answer. But the question is, why is that the answer? I want to understand it so that next time it happens, I can understand that maybe there's somebody in the community that literally asks me the same question, which is fine. I do the same thing sometimes to my Rebbeim as well. The same question over and over and over and over. Because the difference between asking a question outside of understanding the topic and then truly understanding the topic. So he explains why you should choose the Daf Yomi, not just because he might like it, but here's some technicalities that are, applicable to why he would be able to choose that. So number 1, so it says a Torah hisam chayim bishvelo. The Torah is the elixir of his life. It's like the lifeline. It's mechayoso. So I think there's a difference, Carol, as you were asking that question. I was just going to make this distinction then, but I waited for this minute, which is Sam Chaim Bishvilo means it's what gives him life. There's a difference between what gives a person enjoyment versus what he perceives to be something that gives him life. So nobody would be obligated to do something if that something that they would do wouldn't be something that gives them life. Maybe we would actually tell them that even though you want to come to the Beis HaKnesses for an hour, really your mitzvah is to stay home. Meaning there are a lot of people that have an obligation to break their fast on Yom Kippur that will cry to me on Erev Yom Kippur that they really don't want to break their fast. And I'll explain to them that you're not doing your will, the will of God. The Ratzon Hashem, you have to decide, are you doing your will or are you doing God's will? God wants you to break your fast. For whatever the reason, you have to break your fast. You have to break your fast. You're not doing an Aveir, you're doing God's will. So maybe this guy says, I want to come and I'll enjoy coming. Okay, but maybe it's still the wrong thing. There are many people who would say that I want to come because I'm in a routine and I can't not go to synagogue and I can't not go to the class. There's a lot of different reasons that people would give, but maybe that's the wrong thing. And you have to tell somebody, listen, if I tell you how many conversations I have with people over the past year, I know you want to go to Minyan. I also want to go to Minyan. I know you want to go to a Torah class. I know you want to walk around without a mask. We all do, but you can't. So handle it, So that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right thing. But because of the fact that it's Sam Chaim Bishvilo, and it's obviously clearly not dangerous to him, I would assume so, that it's the elixir of his life, it's a lifesaver. So then that might be. Why? Kind of like your meta principle, right? Sid Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. He explains here that anything that is a lifesaver, I'm not talking about the candy, but the lifesaver, it's hamarapa that causes healing. It says doicha kol mitzvos. It pushes off all of the mitzvos. There's nothing, we know that's sakanas nefashos. Now, this doesn't only have to be physical things, but even in a mental anguish, a mental illness, when a person feels that there's a certain chayim, that there's a sam, which is the elixir, the medication, that's marapeh, that heals. So then the din is, the halacha is, the ruling is, the teaching is doches kol mitzvos. It pushes away all the mitzvos, and therefore it overrides everything. So therefore, since that would be the case, maybe it will prolong his life. Maybe it will activate something that will create a different level of not only physical healing, but mental healing as well. That's number one. Okay. Number two, the second reason he says, is me'ikar adin. You should know that from the letter of the law, he's hu poter mitfilas betzibor biglal machoivav hakoshim. Really, you should know that they're not equal. Whenever you're asking a question, I want to know, is this one better or is that one better? I have to know that are they on the same level? If the answer to that question is that they're on the same level, good, you have a question. I can't do both of them. I have to do both of them, but I can't do both of them. I'm not expected to do something that I can't do. So if I'm not expected to do something that I can't do, so which one do I choose? So here in this case, really because of the fact that he's ill, he's exempt from tefillah b'tzibur. So really, this second answer is that he really has no question. He doesn't have an obligation to daven with a minyan. He just wants to daven with a minyan, but he has no obligation. So once he's potter from tefillah b'tzibur, because of the fact that he's ill, because it's very difficult for him, so therefore, so that because he finds himself in such a situation, he's exempt. Now, exempt doesn't have to necessarily mean that he's exempt, but he still doesn't wish to fulfill that exemption. There are a lot of people that once they're exempt, that's it. They're going to take that free ticket, that get out of jail free card all the way to the bank. That's not this guy. So he still wants it. He's desirous of it. So a person's putter. And there are different categories on halacha. We don't have to get into this now, but there's something the Gemara tells us. There's a putter of a lasser, and there's putter that's not of a lasser, which means if something's exempt. So does that mean if I'm exempt, that means I can still do it if I want to do it? Or does it mean I'm exempt and I really shouldn't do it and it's prohibited if I do that? We know that this is a very, very hot button topic as it relates to who's exempt. If you're exempt, I want to do it anyway. And if I want to do it anyway, why should I be held back from doing it? So I'm telling you that there are certain, the Gemara explains that there's just a litany of categories of just different explanations of how that's true. So there's certain times where something's putter exempt, but if you could do it, so you should do it. But if you, even though, that's number one, or number two is that even though you're exempt, you want to do it, you still can't. It's still usser. I'll just give you one example. And there's certain obviously caveats. That one example is, take for example, Sfiras HaOmer, right? Not such a exciting example, but an example nonetheless, just to learn the topic. What's Sfiras HaOmer? We have an obligation to count the days, the weeks from Pesach to Shavuos, right? There's a mitzvah to count. It's a mitzvah saseh d'oraisa. Now, obviously, today it's d'rabbanan, but it's still a mitzvah to count as it was in the times of the temple to Pasuk and Chumash. Got it, right? So now, since it's positive and since it's time bound, women are exempt from that mitzvah. So what happens if a woman wants to do it? So the answer is that she's allowed to do it in that example. However, certain mechanisms should ideally be in place to help be sure to it that because of the nature of a man who usually goes to minyan and hears the counting in shul, and the woman who doesn't usually have that. Today it's different because now you get all these reminders and apps, and the OU has daily email reminders, so that it seems to be able to be something that everybody could do. But there's a halacha concept of omer al gabav, that you need to have a reminder. Someone will take responsibility for you. Now, for everybody, now it's true, you could say that there are women that are way more scrupulous than some of the derelict men. That's of course true. But as it relates to which situations it's exempt, but prohibited, but exempt, but allowed if possible with certain provisio, that's obviously a debate in and of itself. But so the second idea is that the first idea is that it's the elixir that gives him a life-saving elixir. And the second is that he's really exempt from tefillah b'tzibur, so it's not really a question. So therefore, it's not so much because it's Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, but he doesn't have the question. You're potter, you're exempt from because you're ill. So because you're ill, because you're in pain, so therefore you don't have to daven. You get better to daven at home. And the third reason is, and this is a very interesting reason, they're all very interesting reasons, is the Gemara is Nemar bebrachos daf beis amud aleph. If you look in the footnote there, in the third footnote. He explains the Gemara in Maseches Brachos on folio B, the first side. He explains, so he says that Shekarim Shema Lifnei Tefillah K'tei La'amod B'Tefillah Mitoch Divrei Torah. Now, what is that? Ve'eslo Shizeo Hashiur. What does that mean? That what's the relationship between saying the Shema and having it just immediately juxtaposed to or prior to the saying of the Shemona Esrei? So the question is, what are you bringing into your Shemona Esrei? You know that before you say Shemona Esrei at Mincha, what do we say? We say Ashrei. Why do you say Ashrei? In a very basic way of explaining that, it's like revving the engines. You don't want to just walk in. You're here, you're in the office all day, you were just on the phone, you're just texting somebody, you just came out of the grocery store, now you're going to step into Shemona Esrei. You're standing in front of the Almighty. Dalif Nemiata Omed. Now you're going to just have that conversation random. No. Ashrei Yoshvei Veisecha, Odi Hallelu Chasela. I'm saying chapters from Tehillim. I'm expressing praise for she who finds house in the company of the Lord. And therefore I'm like revving my engines. I'm starting the process. I'm focusing my mind. I'm thinking about the intent necessary for tefillah. So therefore I know that I'm not just going to randomly step into Shemona Esrei. There's going to be a preparation. So too we see that the Gemara tells us here, this is the Gemara we're learning now. The Gemara says that when a person steps into Shemona Esrei, it's ideal for a person to step into Shemona Esrei, not just Asher Yishvei Veisecha, okay, that's what we do, but there's something else, Mitoch Divrei Torah. What does that Mitoch Divrei Torah mean? That means if you come into Shemona Esrei, you just learned. You have some words of Torah on your lips. You have some words of Torah in your mind. You have some words of Torah in your heart. So that will make your tefillah a little bit different. The Gemara says that you should walk into Shemona Esrei mitoch divrei Torah. Now, you're not going to have a Gemara Daf Yomi Shir or go to a class right before you're going to step into Shemona Esrei. So the Gemara says, you know what you could do? You could say the Shema, which is what we do. The Shema, of course, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is the meta pasuk that reminds us of Kabbalas Oma Hu Shamayim, the acceptance of God's yoke and sovereignty and Malchus kingship. But what it also does is V'yaftas Hashem Elokecha B'chol Levavcha V'chol Nafshecha is psukim from Chumash. It's learning Torah. You have fulfilled your mitzvah of V'hagisa B'yom V'layla to study the Torah if you have in mind that the recitation of the Shema is also fulfilling the study of Torah. I'm reading the Bible. I'm studying the Chumash. Just because I get to those psukim, and even though they're familiar to me because I say them 2 times a day or 3 times a day because of Kriya Shema Lamita, that doesn't mean it's not study of Torah. It is Limud Torah. So if it's Limud Torah. So therefore, the Gemara says here's what we can understand is if you're going to go to the shir, to the class first, so then you're going to stand in Shemona Esrei with this package of goods, of holiness that's going to then kind of make the tefillah experience all the greater. And so this is a third reason. Here, this is the reason why he says here, you should go to the Daf Yomi Shir, choose the learning. Not just only because of Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. It's interesting that wasn't the answer that was given. And even though that's the conclusion, so it seems, we're going to see another little caveat to that. But that actually brings up a whole host of other questions is, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, is replete with a whole litany of just a pecking order of what you're supposed to do in the morning and what things you're not supposed to do before you daven. So for example, before you do anything in the morning, you say, Ma'odani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam, and the first thing that a person is supposed to do is pray, is to daven. Once you become preoccupied to do other things, you're, in essence, Chazal tell us, the rabbis teach us, you're showing that there's a certain priority for other things before the ultimate priority, which is engaging God and speaking to the Almighty. So a person exercises, a person travels, a person does business beforehand. Obviously, the short-lived, laser-focused things that are for specific reasons, there's certain leniencies. I'm just talking about what the first thing for a person to do at best is for a person to pray. Now, what about learning? Is studying Torah considered something that's also not allowed? So there's a discussion that the first thing you should do is you should daven. Now, obviously, when we say learning is also able to be done first. In fact, what we just learned now, maybe it's even considered ideal for you to learn first. My grandfather, of blessed memory, used to always study for several hours before he got to davening. Something to be said for studying before Torah study before tefillah, as we just learned. But when we say you could study Torah, it doesn't mean that you could study Torah without making any of the preliminary blessings. You have to make first the bracha, asher kedishanu b'mitzvosav, asher yotzas es ha'adam birchas haTorah, and then only then can you begin to study Torah. So therefore, the shir, the Gemara shir, the Chumash learning that you want to do beforehand, all the things you want to do before davening certainly carries great weight and certainly is a great merit. but can never be done before any basics of davening. Whether it should be done before Shemona Esrei, some would offer that it shouldn't be, but we understand from this Gemara that sure, not only can it be done, but some argue that this Gemara is teaching that it should be done beforehand, and therefore it's going to enhance, enrich, it's going to enlighten, it's going to make it more meaningful. If in fact you don't just show up at Shemona Esrei, you have it be meaningful because of how you've prepared for it. Like anything in life, what you prepare for is how it ultimately is experienced, better or for better or for worse. So those are the three examples as to why, just in the footnotes, this first opinion is that Sheyachal Livchar Daf Hayomi, you should choose the Daf Yomi. A, because it's the medicine of his elixir of his survival. The number two is because really he's technically exempt from it, so therefore it's not really a question. And number three is that the reason why we say the Shema juxtaposed to saying the Shemona Esrei is because it's a good idea. The Gemara says to enter the tefillah mitoch divrei Torah, and that for him ve'etzlo zeu hashir, for him the shir is doing just that, and so therefore it would be permissible for him to do that. Okay, good. Now this question was then asked, next paragraph, to Rabbi Eliashiv of blessed memory, and he actually said something which is very interesting. He said, "I'm going to let you v'hu hitter b'doichik gadol ki amar shekasha lahater ba'ofen kavua laha'eder mitfila b'tzibur." Now, what does that mean? That means they asked Rabbi Eliashiv, who was the venerable sage, the Talmud Chacham Gadol Hador at the time, before he passed away a number of years ago. And the result was, he says, okay, listen, I understand that the answer you got from your local rabbi is that you should go to the Daf Yomi Shir for the reasons you give. And I explain, and I go with that. That makes sense. No problem. But he actually added another caveat. There's going to be two caveats which we'll learn, but here's the first. The first caveat that he said is, I'm going to agree with that, and I'll rule that you should go to the class before you go to the davening, but I'm going to do it b'doichik gadol. What's b'doichik gadol mean? With great hesitancy. You gotta really push me. You gotta really press this to me. Why? Which means it's not a slam dunk. It might be like very obvious to some, but it's not very obvious to me. Why? Because if you remember, a number of years ago in at our annual dinner, we honored the millionaires. Remember that? The guests of honor were the millionaires. Why did we do that? We weren't just trying to look for an honoree. The reason why is because millionaire is like a very, very special thing. And he explains is that because he is la'eder, he's in the flock that go to Tefillah B'tzibor, that's something that's a very special thing. Like he's counted as those, scrupulous ones who come to the minyan every day. So because that's something that he does all the time, I'm not going to be so quick that he has that 1 hour. Let him go to that thing, because even it might be that the learning is something that's going to be super important to him, but he can learn at home. Once you take away somebody who's like essential to the minyan, who's a millionaire, right? This is like who he is, and this is how he is defined and how he's described. The Gemara tells us that when a person comes to the minyan regularly and then they stop coming to the minyan, God himself asks, where's this person? Where's this person? So therefore, he is in the Eider of Tefillah B'tzibor. He is in the flock of those who come to Tefillah B'tzibor. And so therefore, because that's the case, it's not so simple. He agrees in the conclusion that he should do that, but it wasn't like a slam dunk. He had to be convinced a little bit of it, if that makes sense. Okay, and then finally, last two paragraphs, we'll bring these last two ones to a little bit of a little more succinct, and then we'll take questions. Is that so? Everything in life is about what might lead to something else. So in the last section here, it says, Yadua she's ametz gamlis pal betzibur ad kamash yochel, which means the fellow who told him that he should go to the learning. It's kind of like what I said about the Rabbi who would say, study this, and if you study this, it will lead to that. Now, what does that mean? So he said that here's another caveat. This is why when somebody asks a question, the rabbi or the authoritarian or whoever the person is who's answering the question has to always take into consideration not just the question, but the questioner. So the person who's asking this question here is a specific person that, yes, he's someone who's considered in the Eider Mitfila B'tzibur. He's considered in the company and in the flock of people who go to regular millionaire. But what he understood, the rabbi, what he understood is that the person who's asking this question, here's what's going to happen. The likelihood is that he has an hour. The likelihood is he's going to go to the Daf Yomi Shir, and after he goes to the Daf Yomi Shir, he's going to Yadua Shis Ametz Gamlis Pala B'tzibur. What does that mean? He's going to find the strength. He's not going to be able to hold himself back from going to the davening, right? He might not have, if he went to the davening first, have had the strength to go to the later Daf Yomi share, because that might have tapped his strength. But because of how dear davening Tefillah B'tzibur is to him, how important it is to him, so then the likelihood is that he's going to go to the learning, and then he's going to go to the davening because it's going to be too intoxicating for him. It's going to be too exciting for him. He's going to want it too much. Ad kama sheyochel, and as much as he's able to. That doesn't mean he's going to be able to stay the whole time, and it doesn't mean he's necessarily going to. Then he's going to have to be able to stay at all, and that doesn't necessarily mean that only if he would be willing to stay would that be the answer. No. But he knows who he's talking to. Once you get him involved, once you see what's going to be, he's going to come to the Gemara. He's going to be all on fire. He's going to somehow be real lit. Seem to feel better. And so therefore, so therefore, because of the fact that even though maybe it could be argued that he should go to the davening first, no, because he's going to then also go to the davening. So there, you should also know then that's another reason. And finally, and this is the last small little section, which is V'yiyun B'Ramah. And this is the Ramah is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Ashkenazic halachic authority in Orach Chaim and Shulchan Aruch, explains. Now, Vafilu Hachi. Now, even though there are times, and this is something that as we hopefully begin to prepare for coronavirus, coming out of a stage of ultimate and strong sequester, where we're going to hopefully be able to talk about coming out of it. Obviously, we've come out of it on some level, but really ultimately coming out of it. This next statement is something that has been a great fear of rabbis and all of us, community leaders and community members together. A person should ideally not accustom themselves not to daven with a minyan, not to daven tefillah b'tzibur. Why? Because of how important it is. Obviously, there are circumstances that make it possible and make it permissible for a person not to. That goes without saying. But here's the fear, is that even though there's one or the other, what happens when you choose one thing over the other? You have to be very robust and very strong to maintain the fervor to be able to do it even after the situation passes. Maybe this guy's going to get better, but okay, he became accustomed to not coming to the shul. We've been very fearful, Rabbanim, community leaders, that what's going to happen after Corona when people have become more comfortable davening at home. By the way, you know what happens when you daven at home? The speed is your own speed. The drush is a little shorter, right? You know, anybody, schnussling in your ear and talking and bothering you. And it could be argued that by the way, it's been argued, many people have said to me that the quality of their davening has enhanced manifold. That's a very sad commentary of our Tefillah B'tzibur. We have to strengthen our Tefillah B'tzibur, but we all know that one of the losses is that when a person becomes accustomed to doing things and we're not sure how we're going to get it back, what is going to get people to come back? And as great as it's been, being able to have crowds and people, obviously we're talking about safety and vaccines and masks and social distancing. I'm not, those things are obvious. I'm talking about when a person the key word is yargel. Yargel is a custom. They become regular. The things that we do that are regular, the things that we do that are, fabricated in the sense of who we are, that's part of the part and parcel of our definition. So we have to be very careful. A person should always be careful not to say, okay, I don't daven b'tzibur, I daven at home. Obviously, there's situations that require that and demand it and expect that. But then there's situations where, if all things being equal, we don't want anybody to get used to davening without a minyan. So that's why we make the conclusion of this case tenderly, would offer that advice tenderly, because yes, one thing will lead to something else. It doesn't have to necessarily lead to something else, but when you have a situation where it's going to be, one or the other, so the ruling here is that the learning comes first because of these other answers, but we also want to be very careful that it never really comes at the expense of. We would assume that once he would get better, once he'd be able to go to both, and even if he wasn't yet fully better, it seems like from the person who's asked the question, he's the type that will probably go anyway. But the hope is that even after the situation that he's in passes, that he'll be able to go back to what we call business as usual. And finally, last thought before I'll take any questions or curiosities as an addition you might have is, you can see kind of on the bottom of that page there, is what happens in a situation where you have a child and they're, you're going to reach them. You got 1 hour to reach that child, right? You're an educator, you're a parent, you're a grandparent. What are you going to use that 1 hour? What are you going to use those 5 minutes for? What are you going to teach them? What's going to light them on fire? So you're going to choose a safer, a topic, a perspective that's hopefully going to kindle a flame, that it's not going to be a one and done. It's going to be a one and I want more type of things. Again, whether or not a child should go to davening or a person should go to learning. So the ruling actually is very different. Actually, in the conclusion here, just, I know we're starting to run out of time, but in the case of a child, they are told that they should go to davening first, because davening is a preliminary to their learning. And I think we see that a lot in shul and in shuls around, is that children could use a lot of chizuk, a lot of strengthening of how to behave in shul. Children, it's not just a roving and a roaming, but there's a reverence, there's an awe, there's a deference. If I ever see a child like throw a ball in shul, I try to tell that child peacefully and lovingly that this is a place of awe and trepidation, not a place of fear and uninviting, but there should be an understanding of what a place is and where you go and how you act. And actually explains that when a child understands the importance of tefillah, then they, by definition, will then understand the importance of learning. So for a child, it might be a little bit of a reverse, but for a person who understands both of them, you have one, assuming that it's not just something that's a want, but it's something that's a need, something that will be mechaya him, that will save him, be the elixir of his life, and for the other reasons that we give. So the ruling in this case is that he would choose to first go to the learning, and then he would choose to go to the davening. And even though this is a little bit distinct, it's only distinct because it's a little bit of a different case from what we learned previously, that it's the first opportunity. So it's not that he goes to learning because it's earlier in the day. He goes to the learning because of the uniqueness of the case of the situation. Okay? Questions, comments, concerns? We went into a lot of different spokes here and different little...
Rabbi,
topics.
by virtue of the fact that davening is time bound, wouldn't that be a priority? You can learn anytime, but you have to daven in specific time, at specific times. Would that have any influence?
Yeah, unless he was exempt because of his illness. You're right. So the idea of positive time bound, the difference between davening and davening in times is the difference between time bound or not, which means the obligation that everybody has, men and women alike, is because the concept of tefillah supersedes time. You can daven at any time. You wake up in the middle of the night, you can daven any time. What you can't do in the middle of the night is daven shachris or daven mincha. You can daven ma'ariv, but you can't daven shachris and mincha. That is, the Talmud teaches, also related to offerings, karbanos, also related to the avos, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But technically speaking, you're right, that he has an obligation to pray at a certain time. But really, he has an obligation to pray at a certain time, which he can still satisfy that by doing that at home. He doesn't have to necessarily do that in the synagogue. Now, if he had an obligation that was specific to being with other people, right, and that was what he had to do in that time period, then it might be different. So if I, for some reason, or you, anybody has for some reason, the reason that they cannot be at synagogue, they still have to daven within that period of time. So this guy, he's not being told that he shouldn't daven at all. The question is, which one should he do in shul? Does that make sense?
Okay.
But it's a very important classification distinction between davening and davening in the right time.
So I
Gotcha.
have another question about his illness and davening for refuah shalema. So no one mentioned in any of the responses in the footnotes that if the man is sick, that davening b'tzibur is maybe more effective in getting a refuah shalema, given the tzibur and all of that. No one talked about that. Am I misunderstanding something?
Nobody talked about that being a more effective.
In other words, we say that davening b'tzibur is you even in Russia, davening is important. There's more. It's a better davening. It's more valuable, or what, or so on. So what I'm saying is, if you say that, isn't it therefore because he needs a refuah shalema, does it mean that getting the refuah shalema is more likely?
I don't think so.
Davening b'tzibur.
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. The reason why is because in the second footnote, the Mishnah Brewer, which is commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, is a person who's a chole is pater from tefillah b'tzibur. Whereas you would maybe think that the Chavetz Chaim would write, because he's a chole, here's another way for a person to be able to relieve himself from illness. No, it might be that it's true that according to the Rambam, a wicked person is able to have his tefillos heard. And the tefillah b'tzibur is able to make it such that the petition is greater. And that's why we daven for people, actually, in a tzibur. But it's not necessarily that he himself has to be there. He's not limiting his own self.
I get that. But even though you're putter from davening, isn't it still better? Isn't it still better for you to daven? Isn't it still better for you to daven b'tzibur, even though you're putter? So, but none of them looked at it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, true. I don't know if this is a reason, but I'll tell you what just comes to mind now, which is it could never be like a universal slam dunk that would be true for two reasons. Number one is, let's just say this person is he's so ill that he's actually unable to go, but he's his whole life he's been going to minyan. By the way, you should know, I've had these conversations with people. They have become so creatures of habit that it's more painful for them to change their routine than to follow what even the halacha tells them that they should do. So we're worried about, even though they really truly could benefit from it, they also it could be a great detriment to them. They could actually become sicker because really what they're supposed to do is be home, right? But there's a second answer, which is something that I don't know. I don't believe that that's what this case is describing. And I'm not sure that the Mr. Brewer necessarily had this in mind. Obviously, I have no idea of knowing that. But think about what we're dealing with today. Assume for a moment that that's true, that this guy would realize that it is better for himself to go tefillah b'tzibur for his own refuah shalema, but by virtue of the fact that he goes to the tefillah b'tzibur, he puts other people at risk. He puts other people in danger. So a person, listen, people are complicated. This person could say, oh, I'm thinking about myself. The whole world thinks, right? We see the whole world that's like being, right, derelict in that way. I'm going to do what I know is best for me, and I'll sneeze, but I'll sneeze in that direction. Or I'll put a tissue in the hamper, or whatever it's in the trash bin. You know?
No, I actually thought about that question too. It's a good point. Look, I found that the first reason that was given in the footnote was a little bit. It was an assumption that wasn't really reflected in the question. The question didn't say that, he gets, he's enlivened, he gets strength from learning. It was just an assumption on I didn't see that in the question itself.
Look, if you look at the question, the second to last line, now, I don't know who's talking here. In the second to last line, it says, "Hamachaya oso v'nosein lokoach l'chol hayom." Well, now, is that another person's perception of what it is, or is this guy saying, I feel alive, right? If it's this guy, maybe that's why the first footnote is explaining that. You know what I mean?
I wasn't sure. It's interesting what you're saying. I wasn't sure whether Machaya also actually applies to both tefillah or only to davening. I understand that I couldn't tell from the way it was worded, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is either. Meaning, by the way that it's worded, meaning the footnote is assuming that the way that it's worded is that it's the daf yomi that's mechaya also.
And that's what I was saying earlier, that there was an assumption there that I hadn't read. But I see what you're saying. It does immediately follow it, so maybe it just modifies that particular situation.
I would assume so, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a slam dunk, that's what applies to every case, right?
Yeah.
That's
the point. If he is mechaya either from davening or from learning, then that doesn't become a factor in the reasoning at all.
Not at all. Or I would argue that if it would be read that part of what's mechaya him is not the learning, but it's the davening, then I would just read that top sentence in the footnote, Hatfila hi sam chaim bishvilo, as opposed to, see where it says,
Yeah.
HaTorah hi sam chaim bishvilo. The footnote is assuming that what is mechaya him is the learning. But what if what's mechaya him is the tefillah? Then we would read that sentence differently. We would say, Hatfila sam chaim bishvilo, or poshit sam chaim merapa doicha kol mitzvah. That sentence is still a true sentence, but I guess it depends on what it is that is mechaya him. Right.
Right. And the answer completely changes, because if the first answer is it depends upon what this person, what is mechayim, what are his needs, then the answer is, well, it depends on which is the one that has those consequences.
Right. Whereas footnote 2 and footnote 3 assume that both of them or either of them could be mechayim. It's going to the shul for an hour. So it's just going to the shul for that, whether it's the shir or whether it's the tefillah, that's mechayim. So which one's first? So a second answer is that he's really patur, he's exempt from it. So, okay, then you're wondering, well, if he's exempt from it, but maybe is it still not a merit for him? By the way, learning is also a merit for him. So that's it. Or the third thing is that, okay, he's going to maybe come to the tefillah differently, even if it is that the tefillah that he's going to daven is going to be tefillah b'yichidus. Forget about the fact that later on we say that he's probably going to stay for the tefillah b'tzibur, but that's just like, okay, unique to the person. But to the case that we would argue is that even if he davens b'yichidus, so that would mean that if there's something mitoch divrei Torah to come to tefillah, mitoch divrei Torah. But that's very good. That's why we, that's why we have these three answers. That's why we have your brilliant mind to help us figure out where and how these 3 points, how they aren't necessarily in concert. It depends on how we read the response, which is why when you look at a case, whether it's in law or Jewish law, it obviously requires us to know the variables. And when you study a sefer like this, there's as much as you know, there's a lot that you don't know, obviously.
Right. I mean, but it's interesting that what the first answer is that it depends upon what the person's needs are, what will do him the most good, which is different than the other two.
Right. Yeah, and I would just maybe end with, to Carol's question earlier, which is, does a person have a choice? Like, what if your needs are something outside of these two basic, most obvious kind of choices? Is it mechaya oso? Does that mean he like needs it? It's sam chayim. That's the word he uses. The sam chayim hamarape. These are strong words. So that's doches kolam. It's not that hanhaga tova or it's a ratzon. It's my desire. I feel good about it, right? We could argue that you feel good about it, so therefore it'll be mechayim. That's not what it says. It might be true, but it's not what it says. Awesome. A++ for everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
All right, great learning together. Wish everybody a wonderful rest of your Monday, wonderful rest of your week. We'll be in touch. Stay happy. Please stay healthy. And I wish everybody just a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.